All right, so I mentioned our speaker is going to be Charles Clemmons. So let me share a little bit about Charles. Okay? Charles was born and raised on his family's 300-acre farm near Clayton, North Carolina. And after he thoroughly explored the entirety of this 300 acres, he embarked on a corporate career, and he retired in 1993. And then upon his retirement, he dedicated himself to documentary filmmaking, writing, photography, and he utilized these skills to investigate the history and lifestyle of his parents' families in Brunswick County. So Mr. Clemmons holds a BS in electrical engineering from North Carolina State, an MBA from the University of Connecticut, and an AAS degree in film and video technology from North Lake College in Texas. And then in 2004, he received 2 Boston, New England Emmy Awards for his work and production of the American public television documentary Mystic Voices, the story of the Pequot War. Charles has also resided in Virginia, Florida, Connecticut, and Texas, and he returned to North Carolina in 2015. And then in 2023, he published Ayla's Journal.
Ayla's Journal.
Ayla's Journal, thank you. Ayla's Journal, A Tale of Southern Reconstruction. He is an active member of the North Carolina's Writers Network and several other professional organizations. As a member of the Southport Historical Society, Mr. Clemmons has generously dedicated his time to editing all of our videos, and we right now have well over 200 videos on our YouTube channel. Today, he's here to present
A Tale of Reconstruction.
Okay. And he regards this as a work of introspection, and his primary aim is examining the relevance of historical events to contemporary values. He draws extensively from his experience growing up in rural North Carolina, along with his family's oral history and his research on the Civil War and Reconstruction. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Clemmons. Very much.
Thank you, Bob. That introduction. I'm very honored to be here to speak with you this morning about my book, not my book, but mostly about Reconstruction itself, the era of Reconstruction. And this all came about initially because of my interest in my family's history here in Brunswick County. And I did a lot of interviews with family members, and as I'll get into a little later, it's not a representation of their actual stories of their lives or their experiences, but they were inspiration for creating the story that accompanied the history of Reconstruction that's in the book of historical fiction that I wrote. Happy to talk about Reconstruction era, and maybe some of you are more expert on this than I am, but it's certainly not a happy subject, but even not any more than the Civil War itself. But it fell out of the result of the Civil War was an effort to reconstruct what had been the United States. And I think 10 years ago or so, I had very little understanding of Reconstruction. I certainly didn't learn very much about it in school. Yeah. And it was it was taught in elementary school, and a lot of the subjects, a lot of the events and so forth were not particularly appropriate for that age group. And in high school, U.S. history, it depends on your teacher, you know. Yeah. You may get a good presentation, or you may not. And most of my history classes were taught by the football coaches, so that's the way it worked out. So I've been interested in the history here in Brunswick County for a long time. I've researched written records of several interviews with my father, aunts, uncles, cousins, and the interviews produce an outline of family oral history that still intrigues me to this day. The characters in the stories in the book itself, the book is historical fiction, so it has a framework or a background of actual events in the era following the Civil War up until about 1919. But the stories about the people, the characters in the stories, are not based on actual events that they experienced themselves. The intent was to give a feeling for what it might have been like, if you will, living during that period and experiencing what they experienced. So a lot of the flavor, if you will, of the background of the families and their culture and their aspirations and so forth was based on conversations I had with my relatives. But they're not necessarily representative of actual things that happened to them. As I go through the presentation, I'll be showing a timeline of the end of the Civil War, well, partially the Civil War itself, and then the end of the Civil War. And some of the bullets in the timeline will have little asterisks next to them. That indicates that that particular event or that part of the story is represented in the historical fiction novel itself. So there'll be two parts. One is the timeline for the Civil War and Reconstruction itself, and then I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between my research and how it led to writing of the novel itself. The period we're talking about is 1864 in the book, 1864 to about 1919. What was Reconstruction? It was mostly instituted by Lincoln Republicans to accomplish two goals. One was to help the former Confederate states recover from the war and reintegrate into the United States. There might have been some other purposes as well, but what they were trying to do, at least the Republicans were trying to do at that time, was give the former slaves, at least the men, citizenship rights to help them to adapt to the new state of freedom and citizenship. Of course, I say men because women didn't get those rights until 1920. So, in the timeline, we'll start with April 1861, when Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston. Of course, everyone knows about that. And it was the first military action of the war. In July, the 20th Regiment, Infantry Regiment, with men from Brunswick County, is assembled at Smithville and Fort Caswell. In August, John W. Galloway is commissioned in Brunswick County to create a detachment of volunteers to act as Coast Guards. It was a land-based unit to defend the coast of the Cape Fear region. In my research, I learned that, of course I knew this long before I actually started this particular project, that my great uncle was in this particular group. They were called the Galloway Rangers. In 1861 August, the Union troops also captured Fort Hatteras. At that time, apparently, there was a fort on Hatteras Island. And they go on to capture Fort Macon and occupy the New Bern and Beaufort region in 1862. Now, this was the first action where the Union troops recovered territory that was part of the Confederacy. This gentleman is William R. Lee from Onslow County and served in the Union Army. This was a not so uncommon practice following the capture of that region around New Bern, that region was basically under Union control for the rest of the war. And a lot of the people, men, volunteered for the Union cause. This particular man kind of looks like one of my cousins, frankly. He was in the Union Army during that period. This gentleman is Furry Bryant. And when the Union took control of that region, the Newbern region became a safe haven for runaway slaves from North Carolina and from the rest of the South. And they flocked to that area, and they set up a settlement that's still there now called James City, just near Newbern. Also, that was when black men became part of the U.S. Army. Mr. Bryant was part of that group. I don't know if he was a runaway slave or not, but most of them were, because at that time there weren't too many black freedmen around. September 1861, the 31st Infantry Regiment with men from Brunswick County is organized at Wilmington. The unit would be captured in February 1862 at Roanoke Island. After prisoner exchanges, it would be reassigned for the duration of the war. They served at Whitehall, Battery Wagner, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, and Bentonville. And those of you who may have seen the movie Glory, Battery Wagner was the fort that they were trying to capture at the end of that film. And that unit would serve in the Army of Northern Virginia and see action from Seven Pines to Cold Harbor, the Shenandoah Valley, the Maryland Campaign, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and the Appomattox operation at the end of the war. In May of 1862, the 36th Regiment Infantry with men from Brunswick County is unofficially organized in 1861, but it became officially organized in 1862. It's also known as the North Carolina 2nd Artillery Regiment and the Cape Fear Regiment. After the capture of Fort Fisher, it would serve at Bentonville and surrender with the Army of Tennessee in 1865. 1863, President Lincoln announces the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. It was the first time that the term Reconstruction had been used, and it went along with about the same time with the Emancipation Proclamation as well. Lincoln's proclamation proposed a couple of things. It offered a pardon and restoration of property to Confederates who would swear allegiance to the Union. It required only 10% of the population in a particular state, former Confederate state, take the oath before they would start trying to readmit it to the Union. So it was fairly liberal in the sense that he was trying to encourage healing following the war. And Lincoln was always about the Union. And in many respects, he was more moderate than many of his Republican counterparts. In response to Lincoln's proposal in 1864, the Congress passes a more restricted conditions. They increased the allegiance requirement from 10% to a majority of a state's voters. So instead of having 10% required to take the oath and to be readmitted, now you had to have more than 50% to go through that process. It also limited many former Confederates from being involved in politics, political participation in state reconstruction. They didn't want the so-called radical Republicans who were primarily responsible for this point of view. They didn't want the former leaders of the Confederacy to be in politics at all. It also demanded that blacks receive not only their freedom, but equality before the law. At that point, we did not have the constitutional amendments that would guarantee this right. So in that sense, it was kind of forward-looking, but it was much more restricted than what Lincoln intended. And so he didn't sign the bill. Effectively, he vetoed it. During this period, 1865 to 1877, there were two groups of, and this I do remember from my elementary history classes, two groups of people called carpetbaggers and scalawags. And they exploited the former Confederate states for personal, financial, political, and social gain. Anyone know the difference between a carpetbagger and a scalawag? Yes.
Carpetbaggers are northerners who
Yeah.
moved to the south to exploit their opportunities. Scalawags were southerners who just took advantage of their fellow citizens.
Right. Southerners generally did see them as and unfairly capitalizing on the chaos following the war and imposing the rights of former slaves to vote and hold office. That was the big sticking point. By 1865, some 180,000 blacks had served in the Union Army. That's over 20% of the adult male black population under the age of 45. In January of 1865, General William T. Sherman issues Special Field Order 15 that was intended to give free blacks 40 acres land lots and some Army mules. The order became known as 40 acres and a mule. Just to comment on that, I don't think Sherman did his math, but there wouldn't have been enough acreage or mules to take care of all of that. It did give the newly freed slaves hope about their future. They thought that they would be able to recover from slavery and have their own little farms, 40 acres and a mule. 1865, January, the 3rd Battalion Junior Reserves is formed by consolidating other remaining Junior Reserve battalions. Those guys were 15 to 18-year-olds that were formed to fight at Fort Fisher, and they were, it's hard to imagine kids that were kids. In those days, you started working on the farm at age 8, so they were considered all grown men practically. January of 1865, Fort Fisher falls to Union troops and naval forces. It is the last remaining major barrier to the fall of Wilmington. In February, General Braxton Bragg retreats from Wilmington, and the last remaining Confederate supply port falls to Union forces. And we all know who General Bragg was. Or was and still was. In March of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau is established in the U.S. War Department to provide relief and help formerly enslaved people become self-sufficient. Among other responsibilities, the Bureau issues rations and clothing, operates hospitals and refugee camps, supervises labor contracts between planters and freed people, and assists benevolent and religious groups to establish schools. These schools, here's a picture of one, are not public schools. They were religious groups from the North who came down to help educate the former slaves. Until the Union-controlled areas in the South, educating former slaves was illegal. The freedmen's schools were open to whites and blacks, but generally no whites attended. The Freedmen's Bureau eventually would establish nearly 3,000 schools serving over 150,000 students in the South. April 9th, General Lee surrenders to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Although most historians believe this ended the war, other surrenders and guerrilla action would follow for another 2 months, including resistance in the North Carolina mountains and ending up in Texas in June of 1865. And of course, we know that refers to Juneteenth. April 15th, Tax Day. President Lincoln is assassinated. His Vice President, Southerner Andrew Johnson, who was born in Raleigh, becomes president. They still have President Johnson's house in Raleigh, if you're ever in that area and want to see his house. April 26th, Confederate General Johnston surrenders almost 90,000 troops to Union General Sherman at Bennett Place, near what is now Durham, in the final surrender of official Confederate armies and the largest single troop surrender of the war. So the first territory that was retaken from the Confederacy by the Union at Fort Hatteras in 1861, and the last territory retaken by the Union at Bennett Place in Durham in 1865, both events occurred in North Carolina. Most of you probably know that have seen this picture. The Civil War ended. It's also been called the War Between the States, the War for Southern Secession, the War for defending the Southland. It was over, and as you see in this picture from 1908, photograph of Brunswick County veterans of the war. The group includes my great-grandfather, my great-uncle, and my great-great-uncle. In May, President Johnson announces his plan for Reconstruction, his version. It calls for a general amnesty and restoration of property to all white Southerners who swear loyalty to the Union. Johnson declares the large landowners and former Confederate leadership were required to petition him personally for return of their land. I don't know what he got out of that, but maybe he did get something. August and September, President Johnson orders the restoration of Southern land to its former owners. In the fall, the Southern states elect former Confederates to public office at state and national levels and refuse to extend the vote to black men. Southern legislatures began drafting so-called black codes to reestablish white supremacy. Some believe that the new laws amount to slavery without the chain. The image on the right is sheet music for an election campaign song entitled "The White Man's Banner." December, President Johnson declares the Reconstruction project complete. Radical Republicans in Congress refused to recognize new governments in southern states. So again, we have the president who was more conservative, and the liberal Democrats, the radical Republicans, I should say, refused to recognize the new governments in the South. More than 60 former Confederates arrived to serve in Congress, but the clerk of the House refuses to include them in his roll call, and they all are denied their seats. December, the image of the right, federal troops in the South are demobilized from 1 million soldiers on May 1st, and they're cut to 152,000 by the end of 1865. Also in December, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. May of 1866, radical violence rages in Memphis, Tennessee for 3 days. Whites assault blacks in the streets. 48 people, nearly all black, are dead, and hundreds of black homes, churches, and schools have been pillaged or burned. July, riots break out in New Orleans. A white mob attacks blacks and radical Republicans attending a black suffrage convention, killing 40 people. In the fall, federal troops are further demobilized. Now there are only 38,000 remaining in the South. In July, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, granting citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. September, black elected officials are ousted from the Georgia State Legislature. The Atlanta Constitution declares the Negro is unfit to rule the state. President Grant finally is able to get the legislators readmitted a year later. In April of 1869, the Supreme Court decides that radical Reconstruction is constitutional and secession from the Union is illegal. How many justices do we see there?
8.
8. It varied all all over the place back in those days. It wasn't always 9. In the fall, violence against black continues throughout the South. In October, a Georgia legislator is kidnapped and whipped. February, 15th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, mandating that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 1871, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 is enacted. Let's see what that was all about. Here's a picture or a sketch of KKK in North Carolina in 1870. Kind of scary, huh? I think the guy on his knees is a scalawag. KKK violence is intense in South Carolina. There are 11 murders, more than 600 whippings and assaults in just one county. So President Grant signed the KKK Act to outlaw any efforts to deny rights to any citizen. Grant declared martial law and suspended habeas corpus, denying accused terrorists the right to a full trial. They basically were conducting military trials. There were 600 Klansmen who were jailed, more than 200 indicted, and 53 pleaded guilty. After the KKK Act, Klan terrorism diminished considerably into the early 20th century, but other groups rose up to take their place. For example, the Red Shirts. This is a group of red shirts in Scotland County in November of 1898, before the coup d'etat in Wilmington. April, the Colfax massacre occurs. What happened there was the so-called White League, a paramilitary group intent on securing white rule in Louisiana, clashes with Louisiana's all-black state militia. Now, they were almost all black because the legislature was almost all black. Only 3 members of the White League were killed, but some 100 black men were killed, and half of them were murdered after they were surrendered. March is the Compromise of 1877. It's the date that ended Reconstruction. What happened there was, in 1876 presidential election, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was running against Democrat Samuel Tilden. 20 electoral votes disputed in 3 southern states, plus also Oregon for that matter, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. And those votes were perceived to be illegitimate by Democrats because their legislatures were were majority black. There was one electoral college vote win for Hayes, but because there were questions about these other states and their other 20 electoral votes, this commission was assigned a responsibility to resolve this issue. Well, if you followed the Constitution, there wouldn't be a need for this. The person with one vote or margin of win would be elected. So in a sense, this compromise was not constitutional, but it was never really tested. The compromise was that Democrats agreed to let the Republican Hayes be president with 2 main conditions. One, that all U.S. military forces be removed from the South. And second, Southern states must be able to deal with blacks without any outside interference. In this sketch, Tilden or blood, it says. In other words, the choice presented to the commission was between making the Republican Tilden president or continuing bloodshed in the South. The commission chose Hayes as president and a hands-off attitude toward treatment of blacks in the South as a compromise. So Reconstruction officially ended. Segregation and discrimination against blacks is codified and enforced primarily in the former Confederate states. bigotry and violence against blacks continued unabated. Violations of black civil rights would not command national attention again until at least another 80 years in the 1950s and 60s. That was the end of Reconstruction. I'd like to talk a little bit about the book and how I folded all this material into the book. I'll just give you a synopsis. In 1864, two 13-year-old girls meet on James Sanders' small farm just south of Wilmington. Ayla McKenzie is an indentured servant, and Mary Jane Sanders is a slave. The end of the war has left the South, the community, and personal lives in shambles. Jubilation over the emancipation of the slaves by the black folks is replaced by oppression, discrimination, hatred, and violence directed toward blacks and their sympathizers. The two women suffer similar abuse and struggle together with hardship through Reconstruction and into the beginnings of the Jim Crow era, culminating in the 1898 coup d'etat in Wilmington. Through their shared hardships and life experiences, Ayla and Mary Jane become lifelong friends. In the book, this is somewhat controversial because it's hard to read parts of it, because I tried to reflect the speech patterns and dialect of various groups at that period. One group was the southern rural white folks, and that was based on the dialect of my father, and he had what I would call a Scots-Irish twang, and which I thought was unusual for this area in Brunswick County because it's typical of the mountain region. But I think he probably was influenced by Scots-Irish who settled in Charleston and eventually moved up into this area. The two primary sources were used to depict the dialect of the slaves and former slaves, which I consider to be legitimate standard English, and not necessarily, certainly not their own language, but at least a dialect similar to the Gullah and Geechee, but influenced by it, I would say. And the second source was, in the Library of Congress, there's a collection that the WPA in the early 1900s did interviews with slaves in Texas and I believe Maryland, maybe some other states. And they wrote down all of these responses to questions during these interviews. I haven't been able to find any recordings of those interviews, but from the way that of course the interviewers were white people, so you don't know if they really captured it, but anyway, it became one source for me to use and use the language in the book. The other source was where I grew up near Clayton. Down the road from us was what had been an antebellum plantation, and on that property there was a sharecropper named Tootsie. He was called Tootsie. I think his real name was William. And Tootsie spoke what I thought would be very similar to what might have been spoken by freed slaves in the late 19th century. I wanted to show you a picture. This is the actual farm. It later became a farm plantation where his family probably served as slaves. Sources of the novel and the origins of the story, the Mary and Jane and Boo Boo characters in the story, Boo Boo is Mary Jane's son who was fathered by an overseer on the Sanders farm. the stories of the characters are influenced by my family history, which goes back about 250 years in Brunswick County. And the characters in the novel are inspired somewhat by those characters. I did a lot of interviews with, I think I mentioned earlier, with my family, my father and cousins and uncles and so forth. And I think the lifestyle that they lived in the early 1900s, my father was born in 1910, probably wasn't much different from it would have been in the late 1900s, 1800s, I should say. So I used a lot of that material and the stories to reflect into the story. And the protagonist herself was based on my great-grandmother, who was an indentured servant. Also, as part of the historical background, I did a lot of research, the actual story had to be factual, the background of the story, the events and so forth. But inevitably, in all the historical accounts, they don't always agree with each other. And for that reason, some historical details I just didn't include. In other cases, only consensus facts are presented. A little bit about the character Boo Boo, and Mary Jane for that matter. I grew up on at the time it was a state Forest Service tree nursery. And as Bob mentioned, it was about 300 acres, including my father's farm next door, of woods that I roamed around. And my father was superintendent of that nursery, and he would bus mostly black women out from town to pull the weeds out of the pine seedlings that they were growing, and for the reforestation effort that was started in the late 1930s. And one of the women who came out to do that was named Mary Jane Sanders. And of course, she's the character in the book. But her son, she called Boo Boo. And you probably know that boo is a term of endearment in the South. So Boo Boo was kind of like a double boo. But I was fascinated by his name. And I was about 8 at the time. He was a little older than I was. And we used to play Cowboys and Indians. And I always wanted to be the Indians because I saw myself as kind of the underdog hero. And Boo Boo always wanted to be the cowboy. And I think in retrospect that he wanted to be the hero cowboy because he couldn't see that. He couldn't be a hero in his own life, so to speak. The reason for the book, it initially grew out of my interest in my family, as I say, family history. I learned so much about their times and the hardships that they faced and overcame. And I felt an obligation to honor their inspiration. For me, Ayla's Journal is a work of introspection, and the primary purpose of which is to encourage examination of history's relevance to our values today. It was a hard time, it was a difficult time, and the Civil War, in many respects, it still affects us. Availability of the book. This is not a sales pitch. Just for your information, it's available in all branches of the Brunswick County Library. So you can check it out there, literally check it out. Also, you can order them through your local independent bookstore. There's an organization called bookshop.org. It's a nonprofit. And a lot of the local bookstores around the country and in North Carolina are part of that. So you can order through bookshop.org, and it helps out the local bookshops. So you can get it through them, or you can walk into your local bookshop and ask them to order it. It's also available in person from National Book chains like Barnes and Noble, and you can order it online from national bookstore chains as well, Amazon, Walmart, and so forth. You know what? I wanted to do one reading from here. Not so much the story as a statement of historical fact. It talks about, and we're talking here about Civil War casualties. And the estimates vary, but most accounts say that about 620,000 military personnel were killed or died of disease as a result of the war. 476,000 were wounded, and 400,000 were declared missing. Perhaps as many as 100,000 civilians died from combat, disease, or starvation. Over 1 million horses and mules were killed. Casualty estimates do not include those who came home psychologically damaged. The war wounds of mental illness were not part of the medical and social vocabulary of the 1860s. The War of Armies ended, but the war for a United Nations soul would continue. And one of the characters in the book is a returning veteran who they called it soldier's heart in those days, PTSD. So, stated on the cover, the book has been published, or has already been published on a not-for-profit basis to the author. Any profits received by me will be donated in equal shares to the Thurgood Marshall College Fund and the Better Angels Society. You know what the Better Angels Society is? It's a foundation set up by Ken Burns to do documentaries. And the Better Angels is a term that Lincoln used in the Gettysburg, I think it was in the Gettysburg Address. So, any questions? Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, this is my website, and you can get more information about the book there. Anyone have questions or comments? Yes, sir.
What surprised you the most during your research?
Well, there are two types of research. One was the research that was based on my family's stories, and those were just unbelievable. Some of them, the way they lived, the hardships they went through, and yet they didn't see them as hardships. This was natural. This was the way, this was the order of things. And the way that they weren't oppressed by this, it was just the way, it was what it was. And as far as the history itself, I was surprised mostly by, I knew there was a lot of violence, but it all boiled down to Reconstruction failed, really, because it didn't accomplish what it was originally intended to do. It kind of pushed it in that direction, but it failed because of violence. And that's, otherwise it would have been a great idea, but it just didn't work because there was so many people, so many problems that were unsolved by the Civil War, that were left open. It was an open wound in the South. And the North, the radical Republicans, were out for vengeance. And I think if they had been a little more merciful, it might have worked out differently. The problem is that you're dealing with a culture that's been around since 1619 with the slaves, and it's embedded in the culture. You can't change things without having disruption like that. Anyone else?